Good afternoon, and welcome back to our live stream series. Our goal today is to provide you with an update on liquidity now that the funding has run out for the PPP and EIDL loans. To kick us off and start that conversation, we have Omar Nashashibi with the Franklin Partnership. He is a Washington, D.C. based lobbyist and a strategic consultant. Welcome, Omar.
Thank you so much, Jen. I appreciate you having me here. And I know there's a lot of fast-moving parts and thousands of questions rolling in. I'm currently lobbying with the White House and Congress right now on the 3P program and this legislation as I did on previous ones. And here's what we're hearing as of the last few minutes. We knew there was going to be a process. We were never going to have a straight extension of the 3P program. But we do finally have a bill name, which means we're close to the final line, hopefully here. The bill is now titled the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act. And the deal, it depends on what McConnell says this afternoon when he hits to the floor. It looks like as of noon today, they were scrubbing actual language, which means they are prepping it for a Senate vote, possibly at 4 o'clock so in Eastern time in the next hour or so. Here's what we do know based on conversations we'd had with Hill staff and others around town here in Washington, D.C. $310 billion for the 3P program. There are going to be set-asides for underserved businesses. We are hearing within that set-aside amount, they are going to have a set amount for banks that are $10 to $50 billion in assets and another set-aside for banks that are under $10 billion in assets. The challenge that we've got, though, is there are still 800,000 pending applications that are just sitting there in limbo. That is in addition to the 1.66 million loans that were already approved last week. So what are we doing with those 800,000? How quickly can we get that up and running? Even before you consider those, we're also hearing they don't think this round of 300 billion is going to be enough to get them to June 30th, which means most likely Congress is going to have to come back again and refund the 3P program one more time. On the economic injury disaster loan program, we're hearing that number is at $60 billion. Keep that in mind. They are going to allow those funds to be leveraged to meet existing demand, but the program had $383 billion in requests as of last week as well. So that's $60 billion for the EIDL. How far is that going to get us as well? There has been some pressure on the SBA to at least start approved pending authorization, though I don't believe they had the legal authority to do so. Separately, Democrats pushed for this $75 billion for hospitals with a significant portion set aside to help those in rural areas, along with $25 billion for testing. As to timing, the Senate is going to be in a pro forma session this afternoon at 4 p.m., and unless a senator stands up to object on the will of the Senate, then they will move forward under what we call unanimous consent. So early, just after 4 Eastern, sometime between 4 and 5, we should have it passed in the Senate. That is not the concern, though. The real challenge is going to be the House of Representatives. They are scattered. There's 435 members. They need 215 for a quorum. We are hearing that 10 a.m. on Thursday, they are scheduled to gather on the floor of the House, and that's where they will start proceedings, which will take time. We are hearing there is going to be one member of Congress who does object, which means they cannot move forward under unanimous consent over voice vote. They will have to hold a recorded vote, so we can expect that sometime probably in the early afternoon of this Thursday. Separately, the Main Street Lending Program, we just picked up this morning that it should be up and running within a week, so that's separate from the EIDL and the 3P program. That is the separate that's been put out there by the Federal Reserve, and that's the latest intel that we've got from here in Washington, D.C.
Omar, that's helpful and such good information. It really sounds like we just need to wait and see. We'll have an update and we'll bring you back on Thursday for that live stream along with Leslie, Jack, and Todd to discuss sort of where things stand and what people should do next and what other regulations have come out. We'll also have you available at the end of this session today in case people have some additional questions. Now that you say all that, though, it really does bring us into this question of what should we do for funding now that we're in a lending pause. We have other programs that we've mentioned in the past that came from the FFCRA and the CARES Act. And so we've brought in Chastity Wilson, who's the managing principal in charge of our National Tax Office, as well as Scott Hess, who's a principal with our BizOps Accounting and Finance Department, to answer a lot of those questions and to discuss some of the additional liquidity options. Welcome, Chastity and Scott.
Thanks, Jen.
Hey, Jen. Thanks.
So you guys, it's great to have you here. What I'd like to start with to kick off our discussion is just a refresh for people about what are the programs and what are the criteria required in the FFCRA. So Chastity, could you kind of walk through what's going on with the paid sick leave and EFMLA requirements?
Sure, Jen. And just for clarification, I usually refer to it Families First. As a former IRS employee, I know acronyms can drive people crazy. So under the Families First Act, there is certain leave that certain employers have to provide, but the employee has to be eligible. So I think it'd be helpful, if, like you mentioned, going through the criteria of when is an employee eligible for either paid sick leave or emergency FMLA. So there's 6 criteria, but that's a little bit of a misnomer right now. It's really 5 criteria, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So there's 2 buckets. So the first bucket is going to be employees who are directly impacted by COVID-19. So the first criteria is the employee has been subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order. I think we need to talk about that a little, because this act is one of the older acts, believe that or not, and it's only 6 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks old. But there was a lot of discussion about what does that mean, subject, because as we know, most states have some kind of shelter-in-place order, and I say states or local government. So initially, that was thought that's going to cover a lot of employees, but the Department of Labor has come out with FAQs, which are very helpful. You can find them on their website, that has really narrowed that impact. And they finally gave some examples. That's only going to apply in those situations where the employer actually has work, but the employee can't report to work or telework. And so it's very, very narrow. And I think the examples DOL gives are very helpful. So one is the employee lives in a containment zone, but the employer is outside of a containment zone. So the employer is still in business, but the employee can't get to work because they're in a containment zone. The other one that I think is a good example is you're somebody that unfortunately went on a cruise. And a lot of local jurisdictions say that if you were on a cruise, you have to self-quarantine for a period of time. So in that situation, if your employer's open, but you just got back from this cruise and you were subject to a quarantine, that would be applicable. But that's pretty narrow. The second one is an employee is subject to a isolation or quarantine order by a healthcare provider. So a healthcare provider said you have to be quarantined. Third is the employee has symptoms of COVID-19 and they're seeking a medical diagnosis for that. Pretty broad. Then we're going to move into the other 2 categories, which is really helping somebody with COVID-19. So the 4th criteria is an employee is helping an individual that is subject to a quarantine order or has been diagnosed with COVID-19. At first, that seemed pretty broad. So there was examples out there. Does that include my neighbor? DOL came out and really said it's got to be somebody that's in your household. And then the 5th criteria is you're taking care of a child, and because the daycare is closed or the school is closed. And again, you can't have the ability to be teleworking during that period. So that can cause, there's a lot of questions around that. There is a 6th category, as I mentioned, but it's very broad, and it basically says any other symptoms that are determined by, or that are similar, that are determined by the Health and Human Services Department, which hasn't occurred. So we really have 5 criteria.
Okay. And that makes a lot of sense, and I think helps kind of refresh everybody where we stand on, what is creating the obligation to pay. Now, the next piece of this is obviously there are some payroll tax credits around those payments that go out. Scott, can you talk about how those credits work and what the amounts are?
Yes, certainly, John. And the credits can be tricky because they vary based on the type of, all those types of leave that Chastity just mentioned. So if it's for qualified sick leave or one of those quarantine situations that Chastity mentioned, if you fit one of those criteria, the credit is going to be capped at $511 per day. So that's if it's for your own self-care. And then in the situation where it's for the care of another individual, it's going to be $200 per day. So then if it's a credit for paid family leave, the credit is also going to be $200 per day. So that's the child care situation or the school closing. And then the max credit on that's going to run for a 10-week period. So you're going to be capped out at $10,000 per employee through the end of the year. So And the credit amount doesn't stop there. So it's important to remember that we can tack on additional expenses on top of that. So it's not just the leave that you're paying out. You get to add to that the employer portion of the Medicare tax and the health plan expenses related to those qualified leave payments.
Okay, so once you have like the idea of the amount of the credit, could you talk about like what that actually looks like from the payroll tax consideration? I know we have clients with questions, and questions have been coming in about, you know, if I have a $5,000 payroll tax liability but $3,000 in credit, how does that look? Or if I have $8,000 in credit, how does that look? Could you spend a little time on?
Yeah, for sure. So it's, you know, it's one thing to get through the calculation of how much you need to pay out or how much qualifies under the program, you know, but then you start getting into the weeds of how do I actually claim the credit. And that's where the mechanics of that can also vary based on the size of the credits. So, you know, just the key to keep in mind is that it's available as an immediate offset against your employment tax deposit. So it's meant to be a quick hit and a quick infusion of cash flow. So, for example, if you are going through your normal payroll run and you calculate a credit of $5,000 and your payroll tax deposit is normally $8,000, you would net that credit against the deposit and only pay in the net amount of $3,000 to the IRS. If for some reason in that payroll run your credit were to exceed the total amount of your deposit, you would just forego the payment altogether. And then what you can do is file for an advance refund on Form 7200 with the IRS. So in that prior example, if we had a $10,000 credit, we would just not make that $8,000 payment, and then we would go ahead and file for a $2,000 refund. And with that Form 7200, we can file that as many times as somebody needs to throughout the calendar year. So you can do that each payroll period if you want to try to get that money back right away.
And I think that's really helpful to know. I know we're going to dive a little bit more into the specifics of Form 7200 after we understand the employee retention credit a little bit better. But before we get into that, can you guys spend a little time just talking about quickly the record keeping requirements that you would need for the paid sick leave in EFMLA?
Yeah, Jen, I can take that. I do want to mention something that I think we haven't mentioned up to this point that I see a lot of questions. So I want to make sure we get that out there, is that the family's first leave, whether that's paid leave or emergency FMLA, is not subject to employer Social Security tax. So that's important when you're looking at the withholding. I've gotten tons of questions about what's the withholding on those leave wages. It is not subject to employer Social Security. So be mindful of that.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I think that is a meaningful clarification. We do see that coming in. So definitely something to highlight there.
Yeah, and so what's the documentation? Luckily, we do have an IRS FAQ. It's very helpful, but I look at it in two buckets. In my simple mind, I like to break things into buckets. So one bucket is you've got to substantiate that the employee is entitled to the leave. So that could be, for example, the IRS says if the school is closed, you need to get the name of the school, the age of the children, those types of things to document that this employee is actually eligible for the leave. Then you have the second bucket is what the employer has to substantiate. And really, in simplistic terms, it's going to be documentation that supports your calculation. So you talked, Jen and Scott, about additional expenses. So we talked about you can allocate health insurance costs to that credit. If you're going to do that, I know I've had a lot of clients come and ask me questions. Well, can we just take the COBRA rate? And asked a lot of very good questions. And the IRS says really any reasonable method. You're going to want to document that method. How did you come to your allocable medical health insurance? You're going to want to document how you calculated the credit. So that's really, from an employer's perspective, you're going to want to think about those two buckets and how, if the IRS comes back and asks me how I got to these numbers, what do I have to support that?
Mm-hmm. Super helpful. So the other credit, and I know a lot of the clients are really, wondering what they need from documentation. The other credit that was created as a result of all this legislation was in that next CARES Act, Chastity, and it's the employee retention credit. I was wondering if you could spend some time talking through that.
Yeah, no problem, Jen. So this is a credit that is available. There's two qualifying factors. If you qualify for one of them, then you qualify for this credit. So the first one is that your business is partially or fully suspended due to a COVID-19 order. So, we talked about in the families first, that's fairly narrow. We don't have a lot of guidance yet from the IRS as far as what is a full or partial suspension due to COVID-19. What they did provide was an example of a restaurant where they have to shut down their actual physical location, but they can still provide takeout and delivery. That is a partial suspension. So that's the first qualifying factor. Or your gross receipts have declined by more than 50% from the corresponding quarter in 2019. So you're going to go back and say, okay, what's my gross receipts in this quarter compared to last quarter? And if that's a drop by 50% or more, then you would qualify for the credit. So those are the two qualifying credits. The great thing about this credit, particularly for those that have 100 or fewer employees, and that's full-time, which they have confirmed that's calculated the same way we calculated it for ACA. If you have 100 or fewer employees, this credit can actually be for wages even if you're paying the employee. So that's unique. I've gotten a lot of questions that just seems wrong. Like we're paying them to work and we get to take the credit. But that's one of the benefits if you fall in that small employer bucket. If you're greater than 100 employees, then it's more limited. You can only take the credit on wages for those employees who are not working because of COVID-19. So you're more limited in that situation, but it's a great credit, Jen, because it's up to $10,000 of wages qualify, which means essentially that's a $5,000 credit per employee. So if you're under 100 employees, that can be big dollars, Jen.
Well, especially if you're not getting the PPP loan, right? Like,
yeah,
just to have options coming in. I know one question that I received related to the credit was, is that $10,000 wages or $5,000 in credit per quarter? Is it for the whole period from March 12th through the end of the year? Could you just clarify that?
Yeah, so it would be through the whole period. So like you said, starting March 12th through December 31st of 2020. So it'd be wages paid in that period would qualify. Great question, Jen.
Okay. Well, and then this credit also appears on that Form 7200 that Scott had referenced earlier. Could you guys help explain how that calc works with both of those, with the family's first credits and the retention credit, and how you would present it on the form?
Yeah, Scott, do you want to take that one, or you want me to take that one? I'm more than happy to take it.
Yeah, Chastity, why don't you run with the calculation on the form?
Yeah.
I know the drafts are recently released on
Right. So there's a couple things, Jen. I think, the form can be a little bit misleading. It's fairly simple when you look at it on its face. It's not a complex form. The issue is getting the numbers that need to go on that form and how you come up with that calculation. That's the challenging part. I think there's a couple reminders that I think are really important that you're bubbling up to the surface. And that is, one is you cannot, and I know we're maybe going to discuss this later, but I think it's important to say it now. If you get a PPP loan, you're not eligible for the employee retention credit. But you are eligible to take the tax credit for the family's first leave. But understand that if you take that tax credit, you can't use those same wages to forgive your PPP loan. So I wanted to make sure as we're talking about the form that's clear, because the form does allow for you to claim the refundable portion of both the employee retention credit and the family's first leave. And so I think it's important to understand like how those all intertwine with each other. So the form itself, again, is fairly easy. It's going to be the calculation, which I mean, relatively isn't difficult. It's more difficult to determine, okay, which wages fall in the family first bucket, which wages are going to be eligible for the employee retention credit.
Okay, so fairly straightforward. And I like that you brought up how all this interplays with the 3P loan. When you look at this and then the payroll tax deferral, which is something that we probably need to discuss, can you talk about how it all fits together?
Yeah, and so I know Scott's going to be talking about the deferral, and so you'll get more information on that. But I think the simplest way to look at this, and what's helped guided me as all these new laws are coming out and guidance, is you can't double dip. So if you just think about it in simplistic terms, you can't double dip. Now, deferral is a little bit different, and Scott will talk about that because it is just a deferral. It's not a forgiveness. That is available more broadly. But again, if you're thinking about, like I just explained, so you've got your families first, you've got your employee retention credit, you got your PPP. It's really, you're not going to be able to double dip. And then you have your deferral over here, and which Scott, like I said, is going to talk about. But deferral is still available, even though you're taking advantage of some of these credits.
Okay. So Scott,
and I think I would just add, kind of the starting point too. The Form 7200 may not even come into play for you. I mean, you're starting with your tax deposit that's due for a given payroll, calculating what all those credits or deferrals are, and first you're just reducing that payment. And to the extent you still have a payment, you make that net amount, and you don't have to do anything further. It's really if you are generating a lot of credits, you didn't take the PPP loan, so you have the worker retention credit, or you have a lot of people that are out on quarantine or paid family leave, and you're generating a lot of the family first credit. That's really when that 7,200 is going to come into play for a company.
Excellent. Now, can you talk through some of the deferral provisions and commentaries just to sort of wrap that discussion? We've got a little bit of breaking news from Omar to discuss as far as what's been signed, but I'd like to get some closure on this discussion, maybe talk through that deferral piece.
Yeah, the deferral is something that we've gotten pretty limited guidance on so far. Originally when prior to the passage of the CARES Act, there was talk of a payroll tax holiday, which would have been a temporary elimination of the tax altogether. But Congress didn't wind up wiping out the tax, but they did give us a deferral, which is really key for those employers that are looking to try to conserve some cash here, during the downturn. And the important thing to remember is this, there's not limitations on the deferral like there are with some of the other programs. So it really allows employers of all shapes and sizes to postpone payment of their share of the Social Security tax. And that's going to be on any deposits that would normally be due from March 27th through the end of the year. And then 50% of those deferred amounts are going to be due at the end of 2021 and 2022. So the only real hitch we had is we talked about is if you took out a PPP loan, and then if you're going to wind up getting forgiveness of that loan, you're not going to be able to participate in the deferral. The bit of good news that we caught there within the last week is the IRS did release guidance, and they said borrowers under the PPP loan program still can take advantage of the deferral. The key is that it's only up until the time that they receive notice of that forgiveness. So during the next 7-8 weeks, as they're working through their PPP loan funds, they can take advantage of that deferral on Social Security taxes. And then once the bank gets back to them and notifies them, then they got to stop. So those prior amounts deferred continue to be due out in the horizon in 2021 and 2022, but then from that point forward, they have to make their full deposits.
Okay. One of the questions that came in from the chat is in talking about the deposits. So when making the deposit, it asks for a breakdown of, and I'm reading it directly from the audience. So it asks for a breakdown of withholding, FICA, and Medicare amounts. Are there rules for how to spread the credit over them? So they need to equal out when deposited, or how does that work? Do you guys know?
So what I've been recommending, if you read the statute, is to offset it against Social Security tax first. And then just, there's no really clear guidance. I think what Scott would tell you, and I know what I've been waiting for, and you, Jen, because you practice in this area too, is the draft 941, because there's a lot of questions that I think will be answered on the draft 941. There's no clear guidance as far as when you're calculating the offset, what to do, in the tiered order. Do you do Social Security first, Medicare, and then withholding? I've just been recommending to start with Social Security because, for example, the employee retention credit is an offset to Social Security. So that's been my recommendation. But I'd love to hear from Scott because that's a common question as far as what you're doing in your group.
Yeah, I mean, we're still working our way through it. Like you said, we're waiting for that draft 941. So, some of this is working through the different payroll providers and the software too. They may be each providing it or approaching it in a little bit different manner for right now because of the lack of clarity around that. So we're anxious to see that draft 941 and even get a little bit of guidance on quarter one. The IRS still hasn't come out on quarter one. If you took advantage of deferrals, how you're supposed to report that in the first quarter, and those returns are due in 9 days here. So waiting for more information.
Absolutely. Speaking of more information, just to bounce to a different topic here, I'd like to pull Omar back in because I'm reading in the chat this note that the final number in the PPP is and funding is $484 billion. So Omar, can you maybe come back and give us a couple minutes of the update of what happened, just since we started the live stream?
Yeah, well, welcome to my world in Washington. It really does change by the minute. And literally just about 6 minutes ago, we got an email from someone on the Hill. Here's the latest that we've got coming from Senate staff. We believe that the final number is now going to be $484 billion for the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act is going to be its name, as I mentioned. And for the 3P program, they're not at 310 anymore. They're now going to be at $321 billion is some of the readout that we're starting to get from the Hill. And the set-aside number seems to be at $60 billion. And yes, it's still at $60 billion for the EIDL as well. As of about an hour ago, 45 minutes ago, Senate staff were calling around to make sure no senator was going to object. And it looks like we are in the clear that there's not going to be objection raised by any of the U.S. senators, which means we can move forward sometime around a little after 4 p.m. today. So it looks like within the next hour, the market closes in about 30 minutes or so, and we should be able to have a bill hopefully by about 5 o'clock Eastern. And it looks like there'll be no objection, and then we'll move forward with the U.S. House starting at 10 a.m. and through the afternoon on this Thursday.
That's so exciting. And thank you for the update and for watching and while we're doing this. I know there's a lot going on in this particular half an hour. I know this also gives rise to a lot of questions from our audience. We want to encourage you to reach out to us at claconnect.com, our COVID resource page. We can ask you to click those links. We will be giving you updates live as we receive them, so you'll hear more from us and from Omar. But if you have questions about tax, economic, and workforce impacts of COVID-19, please go to claconnect.com, pass them through to us, and we'll get the right person to respond to you as part of this. So definitely, Omar, thank you so much. If anything else pops up in the next couple of minutes before we wrap up here, we'll call you right back. So thank you all for being nimble with this. Scott and Chastity, I want to come back to you just in the last couple of minutes here, because I really think this dialogue would not be complete. I mean, certainly we talked about the Families First obligations and payroll credits, the CARES retention credit, all of the funding that's available through that. One of the things that we're getting asked about from our larger employers and from our employers who are talking about bringing their workforce back in is, what are some of the income tax credits available? So, Chesty, maybe you could address, my two favorites, which are obviously the work opportunity tax credit and the employer credit for paid family medical leave, just sort of round out the discussion about the income tax credits that are available.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And I think the thing that we need to point out why these credits are so great, we've been talking about employment tax credits, But the WOTC, as we call it, trying to avoid acronyms, but you really can't in that situation. The WOTC credit and the paid family leave credit, they're income tax credits. So they offset your income tax. So very different. So an advantage that way. The WOTC credit is available when you hire a certain group of employees that can include they are on food stamps, they were on unemployment for 27 weeks or more. So a certain class of employees, if you're hiring those employees, you can be eligible for the credit. Now, to your point, Jen, what if we rehire an employee that was already employed, but we furloughed them or whatever through COVID-19? Unfortunately, they're not going to be eligible.
But
right. The workforce is going to change. There's no doubt. I think all of us would agree when we get back to full pace here. That there's going to be a lot of hiring, hopefully, and so these employers may be able to take advantage of the WOTC credit. The thing about WOTC that's different than these other ones too is there is documentation that has to be questions asked and documentation provided fairly quickly. So Jen, remind me, is it 28 weeks?
It is. No, it's 28 days from the start date.
Yeah. So quick.
Yeah. So definitely as part of the onboarding process, so we've got documentation requirements for these payroll credits, but then these are where the employee sort of indicates, yes, I fall into one of the groups that, has a barrier to entry. We expect those groups and the number of people who would qualify, right, that percentage is going to grow just in light of the fact that people have been unemployed. But to your good point, if you're rehiring the same people back or you've just furloughed them, they wouldn't be eligible for that credit. But again, with the shifting workforce, it's important to talk to your advisor to have those procedures in place to take advantage of it. So unfortunately, we're running out of time, which this is such a content-rich topic. I think there's a lot more to come. We really want to encourage our audience to please come back to the CLAconnect.com webpage to gather more information. I want to thank the three of you who came in, as specialists, Omar with the updates. I think that's so exciting. I know a lot of people are hungry for that information. They'll be very excited to hear from you on Thursday. Along with Jack and Todd. Chastity and Scott, thank you for the great information, just the technical walkthrough of what can we do from a liquidity perspective, either if we get denied the PPP loan and we decide to not go that route, excuse me, or if, really we want to consider other funding options. So I think this was a good wrap on that. So thank you all. Thank you to the audience for the excellent questions, our moderators in the chat. And definitely, please stay tuned for more information from us. Thank you all for watching and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, Jen.
Thanks, Jen.